When I was 9 years old, I spent the summer at my grandparents' house in rural Miyagi Prefecture. It was a small farming village, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and the nearest convenience store was a 30-minute drive away. My grandparents grew rice and vegetables. The house was old, traditional Japanese construction with tatami floors and sliding doors that never quite closed properly. I loved visiting them. My grandfather would take me fishing in the river behind their property, and my grandmother would make enormous meals that we ate sitting on the engawa, the wooden veranda that wrapped around the house. On the third day of my visit, I was playing alone in the garden behind the house. My grandparents were inside. The garden backed up to a low stone wall, and beyond the wall was a narrow lane that ran between the properties. I was catching grasshoppers in the tall grass when I heard a sound from the lane. Pa-pa-pa-pa. It was a low, rhythmic sound, like someone exhaling the syllable over and over. Not quite a voice. More like a vibration that happened to sound like a word. It came from the other side of the stone wall. I walked to the wall and looked over. A woman was standing in the lane. She was wearing a white dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat that cast her face in shadow. She was facing away from me, standing perfectly still. She was impossibly tall. The stone wall came up to my chest. The lane beyond it was at the same level as the garden. But this woman's head, even without the hat, was well above the roofline of my grandparents' house. She must have been 2.5 meters tall at least. Her arms hung at her sides, too long for her body, her fingers nearly reaching her knees. Pa-pa-pa-pa. The sound was coming from her. Her head turned slowly, the brim of the hat rotating like a satellite dish scanning the sky. She was looking for something. I ducked below the wall before she turned far enough to see me. I ran inside and told my grandmother what I had seen. The color drained from her face. She grabbed me by the shoulders and asked me to describe exactly what I saw. When I mentioned the sound, the pa-pa-pa, she started crying. My grandfather came in from the other room. My grandmother told him what I had described in rapid, frightened Japanese that I could barely follow. My grandfather's face went hard. He said one word. Hachishakusama. 8-foot-tall woman. What happened next was the most frightening night of my childhood, not because I saw the creature again, but because of how seriously my grandparents treated the situation. My grandfather made phone calls. Within an hour, 4 elderly neighbors arrived at the house, all women, all carrying small Buddhist statues and bags of salt. My grandmother had cleared out a room on the second floor, the one with no windows facing the lane. They placed me inside with a small television, food, water, and a futon. The 4 elderly women placed their Buddhist statues in each corner of the room. They poured lines of salt across the doorway and along the windowsills. My grandmother gave me a paper talisman and told me to hold it against my chest and not let go until morning, no matter what I heard. They left me alone in the room and closed the door. For a while, nothing happened. I watched television with the volume low. It was a variety show. The normalcy of it made me feel safe. Then, around midnight, the sound started again. Pa-pa-pa-pa. It was coming from outside. From the garden below. From right beneath my window. The voice was different now. Deeper. More insistent. It vibrated in my chest like a bass drum. Then it changed. Come down. It was my grandmother's voice. Perfectly replicated. The same warm, gentle tone she used when calling me for dinner. Come down, it's safe now. I gripped the talisman so hard my fingers went white. Something in the voice was wrong. The words were right but the spacing was off, like someone who had memorized a phrase in a language they didn't understand. Come downstairs. The voice came from right outside the door. Not from the garden. From the hallway, inches away. I could hear breathing beyond the thin door, slow and wet, positioned too high on the door, as if the person breathing was so tall their mouth was near the top of the frame. Open the door. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed the talisman against my chest and I did not move. I did not answer. I did not breathe. The breathing outside the door continued for hours. Sometimes it would stop and the pa would resume, circling the house, passing beneath each window in turn. Sometimes it would imitate my grandfather's voice, or my mother's voice back in Tokyo, saying things that sounded almost right but not quite. At some point I fell asleep. When my grandfather opened the door at dawn, his face was gray. The salt lines on the floor were disturbed but unbroken. The talisman was still pressed against my chest. The Buddhist statues in the corners of the room had all turned to face the wall. They drove me to the train station that morning. Not in my grandfather's old truck but in a neighbor's van, a different vehicle than the one I had arrived in. My grandmother said it was important that I leave in a different vehicle so that Hachishakusama could not follow me by recognizing the car. At the station, an elderly woman I had never met was waiting. She was a shrine priestess. She gave me another talisman and told me to keep it until I was 20 years old. She said a prayer over me and marked my forehead with ink. She told me never to return to the village. I am 27 now. I have never gone back to Miyagi. My grandmother died 4 years ago and my grandfather sold the house and moved to Sendai. He has never spoken about that night and I have never asked. But sometimes, late at night in my apartment in Tokyo, I hear something outside my window. My apartment is on the 14th floor. And I wonder if 20 years was long enough.